Thanks very much, Noel. After the Charles Dickens and the Roddy Doyle, when you mentioned David Beckham, I said, oh no, he's going to call me Suarez, the Suarez of financial journalism. But thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks, Joe, for sticking the incentive into the purchase of the book. It's my first time at the MacGill Summer School, and it's great to be here. I've always read about it and never really got an opportunity to go, and I'm delighted to be here now. I also realise it's one of the biggest social events of the summer. Of course, the biggest being the D. Clare Daly's 4th of July party. But it's also great to be here in Donegal as we discuss such an eagerly awaited event, a moment in history that is approaching that will give us poise to reflect and catch our breath. I'm not talking about the centenary of 1916, I'm talking about the match against Mayo on Saturday. So it is also a sign of how far we have fallen, that a conference and a summer school about a topic such as, how stands the Republic, an intellectual exchange about the country that we live in. In a way, it seems unfortunate that we end up talking about banks as part of that. But the reality is, like it or not, banks and the banking system has played a major part in our recent history, as we've heard. It plays a part in the present and will play a part in the future, hopefully for only another while. And it will actually be a very positive sign when, in a few years to come, there's a summer school or a conference or a debate about something and banks are not talked about. I think that will be a good day, and it's one no doubt the banks will be quite pleased with themselves. Basically, in a nutshell, what do we need to know? What happened about the banking system? We've already had, some excellent summaries of it. A combination of banks, politicians, regulators and borrowers contributed to a mess that left a €64 billion citizen bailout of the banking system. At around 40% of GDP, it looks like for our size it was probably the most expensive state bank bailout in a developed economy ever. Just to put it in perspective, when we were setting up NAMA, in light of all of this, the Swedish model was discussed, where in Sweden they had set up something similar during their crash in the early 1990s. The NAMA of Sweden was about 4% of GDP, and I worked it out that the top 4 borrowers in NAMA were equal to the entire Swedish NAMA. So what we were doing was on such an enormous scale it hadn't been tried before. So where stand the banks now? They've been taken over by the state. They have shrunk, they have reduced their lending, they've shipped a lot of losses, and they're still losing money. They've tried to stay alive as institutions as well, with the help of the citizens, but they've had to do that. Bank of Ireland, there are signs, that things are stabilising or possibly going to improve, one would hope, I suppose. Bank of Ireland, Wilbur Ross, the billionaire American, invested €300 million in it, and the shares are up 80%. So he's doing very well on his investment. I'm sure you'll all be delighted to hear that. And Irish Life and Permanent, the life business was sold off to the parent company of Canada Life. AIB and EBS are trundling along, trying to get back to profitability, still not there yet. However, in doing so, they've seriously wounded their customers by having to hike up standard variable rates, and also what they're about to do by having to prepare to move on difficult and sensitive issues around mortgage arrears. So just in one sense, as things may be showing signs that it was going to stabilise and hopefully improve, we're entering what might hopefully be the final phase of this crisis, in a sense. But it's going to be a very difficult and painful one, because the mortgage arrears issue hasn't really been dealt with so far, and it's not going to be easy. Then along comes a man that few of us had ever heard of before, John Bowe, the head of Treasury at Anglo-Irish Bank. The release of the Anglo tapes in recent weeks, in my opinion, did a number of things. It did bring us some new insight into what was going on inside a bank that cost us €30 billion. The tone of the conversations that we heard certainly made us cringe and were generally quite sickening. It highlighted to us also how little we knew about the detail and the mechanics of the implosion inside that bank that had cost us so much money. And it also reminded us that despite a lot of posturing, the government hadn't really done an awful lot about holding a major inquiry as to what had gone wrong and why, and all of those issues. I think that in order for us to deal with the past properly, we have to expect citizens, in order for us to move on and expect citizens to move on to the future, we have to deal with the past properly, and I don't think we've done that. This is a question of fairness. I think it's also a question of justice. But I think, as Brendan alluded to as well, it's also about knowledge. And it's about knowledge to ensure that it doesn't happen again. When the Anglo crisis happened, the citizens of this country, in my opinion, needed two things. This is going back to March 2009. They needed an independent, transparent and coherent set of explanations as to what had gone wrong in the banking system over a period of time, not just about the issue of a guarantee. And then they also needed to believe that there would be some form of accountability or sanction for those individuals who had perhaps been in breach of their fiduciary duties, or even worse, engaged in breaking the law. Politicians at that time, I remember, particularly in the Labour Party, I think, were calling for a High Court inspectorship of Anglo-Irish Bank and possibly Irish Nationwide. I think that would have been a very good thing, because what it would have done was it would have given us the explanations and the evidence given to a High Court inspector, published in a report, transcripts of interviews and explanations from all of these people, Michael Fingleton, Sean Fitzpatrick, David Drum, whoever, as to what was their version of events and what went wrong, and regulators like Patrick Neary, etc. But when the guards went in the front door of Anglo-Irish Bank in 2009, politicians stopped calling for a High Court inspectorship. And what actually happened was the whole thing went into lockdown mode, because there was a criminal investigation going on. So we then found ourselves in a situation where the guards, with limited resources, a very high burden of proof, and an enormous investigation to conduct, there wasn't really an awful lot of information coming out about things. So I think what happened was, in an attempt to satisfy the sanction element of what the public needed, we actually deprived ourselves of the mechanisms to do a thorough explanation piece. And it's that explanation piece that hasn't gone away, and it's that explanation piece that I think people deserve and want. I think that if you look at the inquiries, that we have had so far, and Donal will obviously be very familiar with them, the Honohan report, the Regling and Watson report, the Nyberg report, they have all added to our knowledge and understanding of the mistakes that were made. But they have not added to our understanding of who is to blame and who is not to blame. They haven't brought us any closer to the issue of sanction or accountability. And of course, if the analysis is ultimately that everyone is to blame, if everyone is to blame, then no one is to blame. Now, of course, the boom years generated a culture of greed and misguided invincibility. So in that sense, I think spreading a wide blame, in a partial blame, may seem appropriate, because as a society we clearly lost our way. But there are different stories and different scenarios in that. Take the guy who believed he could leverage up the equity on his home house, borrow a load of money on that equity to buy a whole portfolio of investment properties on interest-only mortgages, give up his job and never have to work again. And as a financial career or formula, that was being touted around the place in books and things like that during the boom as something that you really should do, and if you don't do it, you're missing out badly. A person in that situation, for whom a lot of things have gone wrong, probably has to ask themselves a lot of questions, I think, about what the hell they were at. But take the couple who borrowed vast sums of money for a modest apartment just to get on the property ladder, blinded and let down by the hype of institutions that should have known better. Who could fault them? I think it's very difficult to say you share part of the blame for this. We need a proper banking inquiry, but there are problems with it. It appears as if the only show in town that's being actively talked about is some form of Oireachtas inquiry. I'm not a big fan of an Oireachtas inquiry as a solution. I think we do need some kind of inquiry. Among the problems with an Oireachtas inquiry are they won't be able to make findings of fact against individuals because of legal constraints. It may end up sitting in court as often as it ends up sitting in hearing evidence during the inquiry, because it will be challenged. It may become two-party political. It may overemphasise and become obsessed with the night of the guarantee and what went on there, rather than the systems and structures and failures that went on around it and the part played by individuals in it. I also think that TDs can often, in a Oireachtas committee hearing, seek headlines for the question that they ask rather than a genuine desire to hear what the answer is. You only have to look at newspaper and TV and radio reports of Oireachtas committees. The headline is usually made up from a statement by the questioner rather than an answer by the person being questioned. As a citizen, I do not feel some need to see the former chief executives of these banks walking in on national television live and being harried and kicked around the place. I actually don't. But I do want to hear, or at least read, what their version of events is. And it's about finding the right mechanism that will yield answers, that will give us a sense of accountability and a belief in accountability, that will not become a witch hunt. For example, if you take the role of non-executive directors on the boards of the banks, I have read one article by a non-executive director who sat on the board of one of the big banks, Jim O'Leary, the economist. He sat on it for a brief period. He wrote an article in the Irish Times a few years ago in which he outlined what it was like to sit on the board of AIB as a non-executive director, how things worked, where he felt he'd gone wrong, what he felt he should have or could have done better, and what he felt he couldn't really have done better. For the Irish Nationwide documentary that I made earlier this year, I interviewed Con Power, who was a non-executive director at Irish Nationwide, and I asked him questions about what was it like at the board. Could you have done more? Could you not have done? What were the limitations of what you could do? I found both of those interesting and illuminating, and it made me think and rethink about our own perceptions and expectations about the role of non-executive directors. But they are the only two public statements that I can find anywhere from any of the non-executive directors of all of those banks. I've spoken to some privately, and one non-executive director of a major bank told me that he sat on the board of that bank for so many years, and he said the bank lost billions in the end, but to his knowledge, they didn't break any rule, they didn't break any guideline, they didn't break any law, and they complied fully with what the regulator was telling them. So he's saying, what were we supposed to do? An inquiry would give us an opportunity to find out about all of that. I'll give you another point. Was the board of Anglo-Irish Bank and the non-executive directors, were they puppets for David Drum and Sean Fitzpatrick and the management who ran the bank? I don't know. I've no idea. But one of the interesting things in the Anglo tapes, if you listen to them, is that there are references from David Drum talking about how if they go down a certain road, all the non-executives on the board are going to ask a load of very difficult questions. And it's going to be very uncomfortable, and they're going to be asking about this and asking about that. And it kind of suggests that, they may well have been functioning in a role that we would have expected them to. They probably didn't do it ultimately as well as we expected, but we actually don't know. They're the kinds of issues, aside from just a fundamental witch hunt against individuals. But I do think that we need accountability, and we haven't got it. I would just sort of finish by saying that, we've already heard a lot about some of the madness of the boom. People talk about it, individual stories. I think that we've made a lot of progress in dealing with some of the issues. I think the question of mortgage arrears, there hasn't been a lot of progress, but there is about to be, and it is going to be a very, very difficult phase. But I would be hopeful that it will mark, in some way, the final phase of this crisis. And if I was to summarise some of the madness of the boom years and the change in mentality and where we went wrong, one of the ways we went wrong, as somebody who's written about business and businesses for a long time and interviewed a lot of business people, was we completely lost track of the idea of creating sustainable value. We felt that it was much better to buy and sell something, trade it, flip it, and make money quickly. Creating sustainable value was lost. I don't know if you've ever heard the joke about the guy who built up a family business over a number of generations, and he was very successful, and he had one daughter. And on the day she was getting married to this young fella, he called the young guy aside and he said, "Look, I love my daughter very much and you're marrying her. So I've decided that I'm going to give you 50% of the family business. All you have to do is come in on Monday morning, get on the shop floor, the lads will show you the ropes, and drive the business forward and figure out how it all works." And the young guy says, "I don't like the sound of that." So he says, "Don't worry about that. We'll take you into the head office. We'll get you doing a bit of paperwork, a bit of the accounts, a bit of administration. You won't be on the shop floor, nothing like that. But, just get in there on Monday morning and get working on it." And the fellow said, "I don't like none of that either." And the old guy says, "Look, I've just given you 50% of a very profitable, successful business. What do you want me to do?" And the young guy says, buy me out. So, on that note, thank you very much.